Our next speaker is Butler Shaffer. Mr. Shaffer has been for years followed and learned from philosopher and spiritual teacher J. Krishnamurti. Some libertarians would call the state a tyrant. While Mr. Shaffer will likely agree with this, he believes that state is a lot weaker than most of us think it is and is prone to doing things that consistently weakens it. Usually it has no clue about what is going on, and today's information age, it is on its way out. Mr. Shaffer believes that freedom lies within ourselves. It is our inner sense of integrity, our sense of internal wholeness that no one can control. The title of Mr. Shaffer's speech is Epistemological Anarchy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Butler Shaffer.
I could make the comment that about having Doug as the opening act for me. And in one sense, there's some truth to that, but not in the sense that I'm just following chronologically his presentation. I am not a fan of any politician, much less the Donald Trumps and so forth. I don't care for his particular programs any more than I cared for the Republicans or the Democrats or anyone else. But I was happy that he got elected. And the reason I was happy that he got elected was that he was going to do exactly what happened, and that was to upset the apple cart of the established order. You could see this coming if you know anything about watching history. It wasn't all that long ago that we had major political issues. Some of you from America may remember some of these. Remember when the big issue was whether or not Willie, who? Who was it? No. Who? Willie Horton, that's it. And that Willie Horton should have been given parole. That was followed when George Bush the first was running for president. The big issue in that campaign was whether or not the Pledge of Allegiance should be emphasized. I mean, this is sickness, kids. I mean, and after a while, a few people began to tap into this. I think Ron Paul tapped into it, albeit at a much more intellectual level than Trump did. But you could see that here was a man who was going to just rattle the cage of the political establishment with all of the inherent conflicts, all of the made-up facts, and so forth. And this is something that began a number of years ago with Doug, and that's what I referenced to being an opening act. When we used to go out to Aspen for something that was known as the Eris Society, E-R-I-S, not E-R-O-S, the Eris Society sessions. Eris was the goddess of discord. Threw the golden apple into a ring of beautiful women and said that this was, the golden apple was for the most beautiful woman in the audience. And then the conflict began. And that's kind of where we are. And I think that what we are now seeing is perhaps what those of us who had so much fun at the Eris Society meetings could see, and the conflict between the absurd and the rational, and so forth, is finally going to get played out. And I don't know about Doug's comment about Western civilization is dying. I think it may already be dead. I've long been of the view that civilizations are created by individuals. They are destroyed by collectives. And boy, if you don't see that in the history of Western civilization, when you think of Western civilization, what do you think of? Some guild, some labor guild that managed to create the factory system? Well, no. How about a writer's workshop? Well, no, there was these guys, Dante and Shakespeare and Milton and people like that. We associate Western civilization with individuals. We don't associate them with collectives. And I think that's one of the things that leads me into the comments I wanted to make here today. Some of you may have heard me speak on other occasions of my discovery, if you will, of what we could call libertarian / anarchist ways of thinking. And I remember it very clearly as from about the late 50s to the early 60s, I went through a time period where I was just examining everything. And it wasn't from the point of view of, I want to have this particular idea that is already in my mind challenged or reinforced or whatever. It was with the realization that there was so much more of interest out there in the world than what we were accustomed to learning. I learned my economics at the University of Chicago Law School. Aaron Director was my economics professor. Love the guy. And from playing around with a lot of different ideas from a lot of different sources that I went into just for the purpose of trying to figure out what it's all about. I mean, even my legal education was not done for the purpose of ever practicing law. Either before, during, or after law school did I ever have any intention of practicing law. It was just a fun way of learning how to think. I did practice law for a while, but for the most part it was, the excitement of learning how to think creatively, analogically, and so forth. And I find myself kind of in that same position now. And we came up with some, what we thought were great ideas. We didn't even have a name for this stuff. I remember there's a time period when those of us who would consider ourselves now to have been libertarians, we're trying to figure out what label do we give to ourselves. And my thought was, why bother with a label? It's more fun if you don't have a label. Make them guess. Make them guess what you're up to. But then we got all these libertarian mantras and axioms and so forth. I don't disagree with necessarily, but I'm a little tired of them. I'm a little tired of hearing people talk about the non-aggression principle as though that says something. You don't believe in the non-aggression principle. Do you believe in the non-aggression principle? Oh yeah, I believe in this. The same kind of response that you would get when people were challenging your beliefs in democracy or whatever else. So I'm kind of at the place where I was back in the late 50s and early 60s. And that is to figure out, where do I go from here? I'm not saying where should you go from here, that's up to you. But doing it just from the perspective of, where do I go from here? How do I rekindle the excitement of exploring what later came to be known as a libertarian anarchist philosophy? How can we move beyond that? And part of the fun I had with that question, was reading one of my favorite, I guess you call him a philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend. I don't know if any of you have ever read any of his work. It's Feyerabend. I always have to spell it out because it's an unusual spelling. Paul Feyerabend, who at one time or another taught at 4 major universities: Berkeley, Harvard, either Oxford or Cambridge. I can't remember which, and then the University of London. This is a guy who was pretty well revered. And I remember one of the first things I read about him was sort of his critique of the scientific method. He says there is no the scientific method. There are a lot of methods that scientists have used to advance understanding of the world that we live in, including what we think of as a scientific method, but also including guesswork, accidents, dreams, fraud, all kinds of inquiries that have, in one way or another, advanced our understanding of the world. And he developed this philosophy, which I take as the title of my brief remarks here, what he called Epistemological Anarchy. He said, in the search for truth, the search for understanding, anything goes. Anything goes. There are no, forbidden questions, forbidden inquiries, and so forth. Whatever you find useful, be it in the form of engineering, science, poetry, painting, music. You put together your understanding through a variety of sources. And that's kind of where I am now. And it's not so much with the idea of rejecting anything that I've learned up to this point in time, but still in terms of, we sat down and talked about the way we think the world should run, it would be pretty much along the lines of what we call libertarian or anarchist thinking. But it's a little bit like moving from arithmetic to algebra. You don't reject arithmetic, say, oh, the hell with that. I'm studying algebra now. This is the really important stuff. No, arithmetic is still there. Just that Europeans couldn't do it very well until the Arabs introduced them to the idea of the concept of zero. But then we went from arithmetic to algebra, and then to trigonometry, then to calculus. It was always with the sense that we're going to move to what one of my, probably my all-time favorite professor of anything in law school was Malcolm Sharp, who helped us learn that what's really important in life is not so much to get answers, but to improve the quality of questions. We don't know how to really improve the quality of questions, and why should we? We have been trained from children on, we're not supposed to question. We're not supposed to question any of this stuff. We're not supposed to question any of these arrangements. You're not even supposed to work your own ideas into a term paper. No. You just tell us what the author said. Don't bother with your ideas. Your ideas don't mean a damn thing until you get a PhD, and then people can quote you. And so that's really where so much of this leads up to, is what is it? What kinds of practices, what kinds of insights would help us learn more about the nature of the world that we live in? Whether it's sinful to ask those questions or un-American to ask those questions, and so forth. Gutenberg got us started on all this. Gutenberg, I think, was the first one to really get the institutional order all of Twitter. And it was probably the driving force, if you could look for any one driving force behind the creation of Western civilization. He made it possible for people to actually read things that people heretofore had been telling them. The priest tells us da 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 da. Well, it's not quite da 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 da, because I find here in the Gutenberg edition of the Bible da 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 dee. What are we going to do about that? Well, maybe we should go off and start our own church. The age of science was facilitated by people being able to not just read, but to communicate with other people about ideas that had heretofore been kept from them, either by intention or by just the inconvenience of not having anything in print to facilitate it. Now we're at what I would consider the fourth stage of this information revolution. I think we've had 3 up to this point. The fourth stage, I think, is the stage that is found in the modern technology. We think of it as the internet. It's far beyond the internet. And if you think, well, it's just the internet, we deal with the internet and that's taking care of everything. No, it's not. You've got all these methods by which you can communicate with just about anybody on the planet. One of my daughters and her daughter were back in New York for a couple of weeks. And every once in a while we were just kind of curious, well, where are they now? We hit the 360 button on there? Do you have one of those on the GPS system? It tells you exactly where they are. They're on the corner of such and such a thing and heading east. Oh, okay. That means they're going over to this other place. You and I have the technological capacity. I think it's the first time in human history. We have the technological capacity to communicate with every single human being on the planet, provided 2 things exist. One, everyone has a computer that's connected up with the internet or some other means of similar communication. And secondly, that they were interested in talking with us. It's been a sad moment in my life, I think, when I came to the realization that not very many people were that interested in hearing what I had to say, but that's from my perspective and not from others. And the question that always comes around in terms of asking questions about the questioning process. How will I find out? How will I find out what any of these alternative systems of communication, of inquiry, of knowledge, whatever you want to call it, not just in an incremental sense. We all do this when we were in college and we took a survey course in European history, and then we maybe take an advanced course in French history or something of that nature. What about the kinds of inquiries that don't just incrementally take you outside the circle of your present understanding, but take you way out here, way out where no sane, well-educated, respectable person would dare to go and ask a question like that? What questions are wrong for us to answer? Who's going to be the keeper of the questions that you have in your mind and that I might have in mind? We've long been in the situation where we have a consensus-based definition of reality. Reality is what some consensus is formed around. And who forms that consensus? The people who have an interest in having us think in a particular way. Who might that be? It's the institutional order. I long ago gave up on the idea of that the state by itself was the sole problem we had to deal with. It's the whole institutional order. Institutions generally are the problem that beset us. And by institution, I mean any organization that has come to take on a purpose and a meaning of its own. And we are not supposed to question religious leaders. We're not supposed to question professors or teachers of other sorts. We're not supposed to question the politicians or the media whose job it is to formulate all of the, quote, politically correct answers to questions that we are not permitted to ask. And I go back to Feyerabend's line, and I find it very, very encouraging. Epistemological anarchy. There's no question that can be asked that is unworthy of being asked. And if it doesn't lead anywhere, you refine your question. You keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into the question. So, did I run out of time, Jane? Jane says I ran out of time, my timekeeper. So